I would like to welcome everyone today to the Mirowitz Center program. I am Judith Oliver, and some people aren't familiar with me, but they see me on some of the Zoom programs. So I represent the Mirowitz Center. And this program is co-sponsored with the FEL, Friends Enjoying Life Men's Group. And I want to thank them for contacting Jack and inviting him to participate in a lecture for us today. Jack has been a Hindu for 57 years after having been raised a Presbyterian, and he's very active at the Hindu Temple of St. Louis. He's the only non-Indian who tends the temple regularly and also has a role in the temple operations, and they authorize him to represent the faith. He frequently speaks on Hinduism and gives tours of the temple. He's the founder and executive director of the Living Insights Center, a universal religious and spiritual center located in Clayton. The center honors and nurtures the beliefs of each individual and promotes understanding and appreciation of all religions. It offers altars, sanctuaries, and teachers for as many religious and spiritual traditions as it can. The center is believed to be the closest thing to a museum of the world's religions in the Western Hemisphere, but it's really more a sanctuary for everyone. Jack's also very involved in interfaith activities representing both the Living Insights Center and the Hindu Temple. He's the first Hindu representative on the board of the Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis and currently serves as the vice president. Please welcome Jack today, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you. I'd also like to say hi to Ann Miller, who's on the executive committee of the Interfaith Partnership with me. So I love doing this, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint presentation. And I've been doing this for, I guess, about 13 years and refined it as recently as this morning. First, as an overview, we don't hear much about Hinduism in this part of the world because there simply aren't that many Hindus here. But as you probably know, it's the world's third largest religion. We have about 1.3 billion people. And almost all of those are in or around India. Only about 30 million are elsewhere. We have about 2.5 million in the United States, and we have about 15,000 in the St. Louis area. When I became a Hindu, there was literally one Indian family in St. Louis. So it has grown exponentially. And of those people who consider themselves Hindus as distinguished from doing Hindu things like meditating, yoga, that sort of thing, virtually everyone in the faith here and elsewhere is of Indian descent or their own other nationality, of course. And I'm a rarity. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm the only non-Indian who's really involved in the Hindu temple here in St. Louis, which is, by the way, the only full-fledged Hindu temple, not only in St. Louis, but in the entire state of Missouri. There are other Hindu facilities, but none of them are full-fledged temples like ours. So notwithstanding the fact that I usually am the only non-Indian at the temple, I have been very welcomed, and it's a very welcoming community. Indians do tend to stick with themselves, but if someone shows an interest in the faith, they are very eager to share it. You will hear Hindus say it is the world's oldest religion. And your religion, I think, has just as legitimate a claim to that as Hinduism does. It is certainly true that portions of what we do at the temple remain unchanged for the last 3,500 years. Most people would say 5,000 years, and a number of scholars say 8,000 years. I go so far back, we have no historically recognized origin or founder, but we know the precedents in that part of the world. And the religion while it is that old, I must acknowledge that it is very different now from what it was 3,500 years ago. During a period that roughly spanned the millennium prior to Christ, Hinduism went through something which is very parallel to the Protestant Reformation in Christianity. At the beginning of that time, the religion was pagan and it was polytheistic, and the priests were extremely powerful and very full of themselves, and were telling people you couldn't go to God directly, you had to pay them to do it for you, which of course is parallel to the selling of indulgences in Roman Catholicism, which helped produce the Protestant Reformation. So this produced, as has happened much later in Europe, a protesting movement, which was very protracted in India. And Hinduism responded by changing considerably, much to its credit. So the religion is now monotheistic, it is not pagan, and the priests have considerably less power than they did 3,500 years ago. And everyone can relate to God directly without having to go through a priest. Now, Hindus actually among ourselves do not call it Hinduism except as a matter of convenience, because that is what everyone else calls it. But we call it Sanatana Dharma, which means eternal truth, or the way to attain that eternal truth. The Hindu term actually came from the Persians, and their word for river was Sindhu, and they approached the river now known as the Indus River in Pakistan. And they said the people on the other side of the river, as they were coming east, were river people or Sindhus. So that morphed over time to become Hindus. Sanatana Dharma connotes that there is one reality and that there are many ways to attain it, as I will explain in a bit. It's an extremely diverse religion and extremely tolerant of all religions. But so that there is an underlying reality that we just try to describe in human terms cannot adequately do that. The religion is very poorly understood by non-Hindus. And it is a very rich tradition. We're talking about something which has evolved over millennia. It arose in a part of the world which was extremely diverse. Prior to the British Empire, what we know is India was not a single country. It was 24 or so states, each with its own language and cuisine and this sort of thing. And as the religion spread, it hybridized with what was there before. And, so it became very diverse and very colorful. And over time, in this very rich culture, it took on many belief systems, many stories, images, architecture. And it's really quite inspiring, I think you will find. So this, as an example, is one of the larger, not the largest, but one of the larger temple complexes in southern India. What you are seeing is 4 Raja Gopurams. Gopuram means gate, Raja means royal. And these are entrances to the temple main sanctuaries or courtyards within temple complexes. This is the kind of architecture that you would see in southern India, not so much in northern India, partially because it was diverse to begin with, but also there were invasions from Islam, mostly in northern India. And the Muslims destroyed the temples. They were rebuilt and destroyed again. And the Indians figured out that if you made a temple look more like a mosque, it would be less likely to be torn down. So northern temple architecture does not look like this. The largest temple complex in India is 160 acres. It has 21 of these, and the largest of them is 240 feet tall. Now, the founder of our Hindu temple here in St. Louis, Dr. Naidu, who I know some of you know, the original Hindu temple here was his living room. He was from southern India, and he chose the temple architect for our temple here in St. Louis, and therefore it should come as no surprise that our temple looks like this. A very typical southern Indian style of temple, and the architect is a very well-known architect in India. Our Raja Gopuram is only 60 feet tall, so imagine the largest being 4 times taller than this. That is actually a picture of me giving a tour of the temple to a group of MICDS students, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. What you see was largely carved by artisans from India. It took 2 years to do, and they were not planning for well enough for a climate where everything freezes, and consequently, over time, it started to deteriorate, and it took us another 1.5 years to restore it, about 5 years ago. Now, if we were in India, to enter the temple, we would go through that big brown door, which is 18 feet tall. Not all of it opens, because we could easily leave our shoes outside. We don't have to have coats, but that doesn't work here in St. Louis. So if we were at the temple, we would enter by a side entrance, go downstairs, and then go back upstairs. It's really kind of awkward and odd, but it's an accommodation to the fact that they wanted the temple to be true to Indian design, while still dealing with our climate. Now, as I said, the religion is extremely diverse. Number of reasons for that, some of which I've already talked about. We are not governed by any single scripture. We have many. We don't have a bureaucracy, a leader. The leader of your part of Hinduism might literally be your individual teacher. It has evolved over millennia in many cultures, and so that explains a great deal of diversity as well. But the underlying primary reason for it is that Hindus believe that each person has a right to relate to God in his or her own way. So it accommodates people of all spiritual personalities. So some people choose to worship God. They would go to a temple. Some people choose to meditate to connect with God. Hindus like that might never go to the temple. There are other ways of connecting with God, all of which are called yogas, by the way. Yoga means union with God. And we take this not just within our own faith, but to all people. We consider every religion to be valid. We have no conversion process at all, and no desire to convert people to our faith. If you're happy with your faith, that's wonderful as far as we're concerned. Now, Hinduism is extremely commonly misunderstood, and with good reason. If you go to the Hindu temple, you will see scores of statues, and it will easily suggest to you that it is a polytheistic religion, but it is not. Virtually all Hindus understand that there is only one God. That God is infinite, incomprehensible, indescribable, formless, nameless. We give it the name Brahman, which has an N on it, which I'll explain the importance of later, so we can refer to it. But it is beyond human description, because any human term, even the term infinite, is still a limiting term. And human terminology cannot capture what God is. So one way we might refer to God is to say neti neti, which means not this, and you say that infinitely. But if you're going to try to describe God, you could say that it is an ocean of consciousness that is continually creating within itself, using frequencies, the physical universe. It continually recreates the universe by bringing its own consciousness into dense patterned forms, and that's what we experience as the physical universe. And if you take this to heart, it changes everything about how you view yourself, view the universe, view God, and relate to all of it, because it means absolutely everything is part of God. Now, that's a really hard concept to get your brain around, because it means evil people are part of God. It means Hitler was part of God. And it doesn't mean we condone the evil that beings do, but we go to the underlying substructure of reality and recognize that all of this is God, and God isn't controlling it. God isn't making us do what we do. God cedes to us the responsibility, the ability to co-create the universe within God's self. And if you take this to heart, it means that absolutely everything is sacred. So That starts with people. When we greet each other, we say namaste, which means the part of God in my physical form sees and honors the part of God in your physical form. And every object is sacred. If you throw something in anger and break it, you just broke God. It means every task you have is a sacred act, because every part of what you were doing is an intimate, immediate interaction with God. So I often tell students, you know, if you have a paper to do for your teacher, don't consider it a burden, but view every part of it as interacting with God, because the paper, the laptop, the teacher, the dog that's bothering you, the sibling that won't let you get your paper done, all of that is God. And if you take this to heart, you perceive and then treat everything as sacred. So loving thyself, loving thy enemies as thyself should be a very easy thing for Hindus. People being what they are, it isn't in actual practice, but conceptually at least it should be. Now, according to Hindu understanding, but also quantum physics, the universe is consciousness. You know, quantum physics is gradually moving towards this understanding that the underlying substratum of reality is consciousness, and that consciousness creates what we see in the physical universe. So everything is consciousness vibrating, and that every particle of it is disappearing in and out of existence millions of times a second. 20 years ago, a scientist would tell you if you could see an atom, it looks like a nice little solar system with a solid center and solid electrons going around it in predictable orbits. And that the distance proportionally between them is greater than the distance between the sun and the earth, and that space, which is 99.999% of the atom, is absolutely devoid of anything. There's nothing there. And now they know that none of that is true. These particles that we thought were solid are disappearing millions of times a second, and this void is not void at all. It is full of something. And they don't know what it is, so physicists call it dark energy. Hindus call it consciousness. Now, Hindus believe that, again, the God is doing that, and the God is continually recreating the universe in every instant using a particular set of frequencies for which we have the name Om. So I'm sure you've heard of Om, and there's a lot of confusion about what it is. Some say it's God, some say it's God's name. No, it is the name for these frequencies. It's sort of a composite of the frequencies humanly created. It can't contain all the frequencies that are involved in it, but it's these frequencies, and that is the Sanskrit representation of Om. It's actually a combination of three letters, A, U, and M. And Hindus believe that these frequencies radiate out from the universe through a grid that is called the Sri Yantra that looks like this. And these are downward pointing and upward pointing triangles that overlap each other, and they're constantly rotating in all dimensions. And the energy comes out, the frequencies arise from the center point, and then they are affected by this continually changing grid, which is why the universe is continually changing and is asymmetrical. Now, it is, of course, difficult to comprehend and relate to an infinite impersonal God that is everything. But fortunately, God takes many forms. And that's what these deities that you see at the Hindu temple are. They are forms that the ultimate God, Brahman, takes. And in this part of the universe, it isn't that God made us to look like God in our appearance, but rather in this part of the universe, God has created beings. There may be beings that look totally different in other parts of the universe. But here, God has created beings that have evolved to look like us. So here, God will appear looking like us. If we were on a planet where we looked like insects, God would not look like us because it would scare them. So each of these forms of God embodies different aspects of God. Some are broader than others. And we do not have a single agreement as to how many forms of God there are. Some Hindus will tell you there are 33, with other names for some of them. Some people say there are 330 million. So the actual number is somewhere between the two, and there's certainly not a list anywhere. Hindus who worship God through a form will choose from among the many forms those which sort of resonate with them, but we always will understand that behind the form, underlying the form, embodied as the form is Brahman, the ultimate reality. Now, some Hindus consider these forms to be symbolic and mythological. Others believe they can actually be experienced. I used to be in the first group, and now I'm in the second group, as I, if time permitting, may say a few more words about later. Now, textbooks will universally tell you there are three primary forms of God. One is Brahma, without an N, who embodies the creative aspect of God. One is Vishnu, who is the preserving, sustaining aspect of God. And then there is Shiva, the destructive, but really more recreative aspect of God. Now, these forms of God have personalities, and they are not perfect. And as a result, in actual worship practice, this is not the way it works. According to a very well-known story, which is actually represented in a statue in our temple, Brahma lied about something. And consequently, Brahma is shamed in all of India. There is only one temple devoted to Brahma alone in all of India. For the first 12 years of our temple, we had no statue of Brahma. Now, Vishnu is very important, sustainer of the universe, and also he is the form of God that most commonly comes down onto the planet in what either is or appears to be human form to help people. And these are called avatars. Most well-known of those are Krishna and Rama. I'll come back to that in a little bit. Shiva is very important. He is seen by his followers, and I am one, because of the experience I had, as Brahman with the thinnest veil of a personality. He is viewed by Shiva devotees as embodying all of the aspects of God, including those that are normally attributed to Brahma and Vishnu. And at our Hindu temple, the main sanctuary is focused upon Vishnu, but there's an entire wing that is devoted to Shiva. Now, there's a third category of forms of God, universally recognized, widely worshipped, and they are all female. If you go back to what I said about the fundamental nature of reality being consciousness vibrating or energized, the consciousness is considered male and the frequencies, the energy, female. And you only have the totality if you have both. So consequently, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva have, we call them consorts, but they're kind of like spouses. And they represent the energy aspect of the combination. And so they can be worshiped separately, or they can be worshiped in combination. They can be worshiped half male, half female. So of all the religions, the major religions, this is the only one where it is totally normal, totally acceptable and fine to worship God as male, as female, as both male and female, as no gender at all, or completely beyond form altogether. Now, here are some examples. On the left is Vishnu. On his right finger, upper hand, is a whirling circle, a discus it's called, and that is representative of him sustaining the universe. On the right, you have Shiva, and behind him, of course, you see the Sri Yantra, because Shiva is the form of God generating the Om frequencies and radiating them out through the universe using the Sri Yantra. On the left is Lakshmi. She is the female aspect of Vishnu, the consort of Vishnu. And he sustains the universe. She is the provider, the source of all abundance in the universe. And it is not just physical abundance, but it's also spiritual abundance. On the right, you have Shiva and his consort, half male and half female. This is called Ardhanarishwara. And Shiva then can also be shown this way. This is Shiva doing a dance that sustains the cosmos and continually recreates it. He can do the dance only because he has the female energy within him. So most people, when they see these statues, think it's actually a female dancing. It's androgynous. It is Shiva with the male and female combined. The circle represents the universe. It's actually, of course, a sphere, but if they made a sphere, you wouldn't see him. And it's on fire. Those are flames because the flame from his upper left hand destroys it in every instant. And then the drum beat, Om frequencies, radiating from a small drum in his upper right hand, recreates, those frequencies recreate the universe in every instant. Outside of the Large Hadron Collider, excuse me, in Europe, where they smash atoms to find the components of the universe. Outside of that, there is a large statue of like this. Another of the well-known forms of God is Ganesha, the only form of God who has an elephant's head. And he represents the form of God that runs the entire physical plane. And he also runs the entire system of reincarnation, the entire system of karma, where you reap what you sow, both of which I'll talk about more later. And consequently, he puts obstacles in our way to teach us things. But he also, as a matter of divine grace, can remove those obstacles. And so Hindus will pretty universally offer prayers to Ganesh for obstacles to be removed in their lives. And we'll also offer prayers to Lakshmi, the source of all abundance, asking that they have abundance in this physical existence. Now, I mentioned avatars. An avatar is an embodiment of Brahman or one of the deity forms, most commonly Vishnu, who comes down onto the earth in what either is or appears to be human form to assist humanity. The best known of those are Krishna, who is the ultimate teacher, if you will, and Rama, the ideal person. And the two great epic stories in India largely or entirely revolve around those two. Hindus consider the Buddha to have been an avatar of Vishnu, which of course Buddhists do not accept. And of course the Buddha came down, or we believe, not to change to destroy the religion and take people away. During that reform period, the Buddha was one of those reform movement leaders, and he was born a Hindu, he died a Hindu, and he thought he was a Hindu, but his followers decided to create a separate religion. So Hindus believe that the Vishnu came down onto the planet as the Buddha to correct the religion. And it just happened that some of his followers broke off a separate religion from it. Excuse me. There could be multiple avatars simultaneously. There is not agreement now as to whether we currently have any avatars on the planet. There usually is at least one being on the planet that some Hindus consider to be an avatar. But typically, other Hindus may think of that as just a saint or a guru, or in some cases, just as a complete fraud. I often am given the question, do Hindus believe that Jesus was an avatar? And we don't have a single answer for that. My personal belief is that Jesus was an avatar of not Vishnu, because Vishnu was not recognized and present in active form in the area where Christ was, and that he was instead an avatar of Brahman. Now, why do we exist? What is life's purpose? Why does the universe exist at all? We don't really know. We do believe that each person has a soul, which again is fundamentally part of Brahman. We think that perhaps God has created the universe as sort of theater and gives us roles, not that are written by God, but it's sort of like improv. And that God is observing God's self through our eyes and just observing how we participate in co-creating the universe. We believe that we are here to perfect ourselves so as to advance our individuated consciousness to become so like God's ultimate consciousness that there's no longer any difference and we merge into it for all eternity. And this is a matter of dispelling what we consider to be our fundamental defect as beings, which is not that we are sinners, but rather that we are ignorant of the true nature of reality. We are ignorant of the fact that it's all God, and therefore we go into fear and ego and try to protect ourselves and maybe hurt other people to improve our positions. And we end up doing evil things because of ego, which is based on ignorance. So our goal here is to become aware of the true nature of reality and then embody it in our conduct completely. Now, the good news is that we get as many lifetimes to accomplish that as it takes. Everybody is in Earth School and everybody is going to graduate. Even those who have done the most heinous things will ultimately get there. Death is the end of a chapter of a book, which is a long book and always ends happy, with our being liberated from reincarnation and united with God. We call that moksha. And our rebirths are born, we are born into circumstances resulting from our past actions and thoughts, the system of karma where you reap what you sow. But it's not a punishing system. It may feel like punishment, but it's really an educational system that is designed to give us experiences that will enable us to become perfected. And so this system can include reincarnating in realms which people in the West know as heaven or hell, but they're temporary. And it works like this. If you have been cruel, you may need to experience cruelty to learn not to be cruel. If you've been horribly cruel, you may be reborn in a realm so hellish that it couldn't be on this planet. If you haven't been that bad, you might be reborn in Afghanistan, someplace like that. If you've been wonderful, you deserve the benefit of that. If you've been really wonderful, you may be reborn in a realm so heavenly it couldn't be on this planet. If you haven't been that good, you might be reborn in, well, the life you have right now. Because everybody in this has a better life than most people now or ever have had on the planet. Hindus would say we have good karma. But good karma is not a matter of having a nice life in a good country and all of that. It's ultimately about being advanced into circumstances which will continue to evolve you. Now, many Hindus consider reincarnation to be just an article of faith, but we can recover memories of our past faiths, past lives. Now, let me tell you a bit more about reincarnation. Some early Christians believed in reincarnation, and it can be found in other religions. The mystical branch of your religion has a place for it. 32% of Americans believe in reincarnation, and interestingly, I find 36% of Roman Catholics. And the total number of Buddhists and Hindus in the United States is like 3%. So the vast majority of people who believe in reincarnation are not of faiths that traditionally have a place for this. Now, a good question always comes up. How can you remember past lives? How could you possibly remember with a brain something which happened before it existed? It's a great question. And there's a very simple answer. Your brain, your soul is a thumb drive. So we have a processor, and it has a hard drive which holds memories of this lifetime, but within us is a separate database which is part of our soul, which goes from lifetime to lifetime, and it carries with it memories of our past lives. And we can access those memories by going into our soul level and trying to live from the soul level. And in Hinduism, we don't believe, as people are typically taught in the West, that you can't access your soul until you're trying to get through a pearly gate or, drop your ego, drop your body, but rather you can access your soul by going beneath your ego. And the more you do that, the better off you are, because your soul is wiser, more experienced, and invulnerable. And once you start living and acting on that level, you can start having memories be triggered at that level. Now, Western hypnotherapists, not Hindus, Western hypnotherapists are finding that they offer past life regressions, and people can fairly readily remember past lives and where you go in between lives. And one thing which they are, I think, importantly finding is that people remember that we reincarnate in groups. We are in, some people call them soul pods, and we reincarnate repeatedly with the same souls with agreements reached between lives to help each other grow. So some of the people you are particularly close to, maybe the person you're married to if you're married, is part of your soul pod. Typically your parents are not. If you meet somebody and you just met but you feel like you've known them forever, that's probably part of your soul group. Now, let me tell you how I became a Hindu and a little bit more about past life memories. At St. Louis University for Dave Otten, for a number of years, I have given, and he's retired now, but I've given hour-long talks about just this slide. So I can go into a lot of detail, but time permitting what it does today, I will only touch on the second and third parts a bit. But I think it's worth knowing how I became a Hindu. At age 14, in 8th grade, at the age of 13, I had taken a world religion class. There were not many secondary schools that had world religion classes then, but I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Burroughs, and we had a teacher who knew Houston Smith, who had been a professor at WashU and is generally considered one of the foundational scholars of comparative religious study. And he really understood Hinduism. We read his book, which many schools still use. Dave Otten used it the whole time he was teaching, for example. And it was a small book. I had just been confirmed as a Presbyterian, maybe while I was in that class, in fact. And I found religion to be, frankly, kind of boring, nowhere near as interesting as football and girls. So anyway, I took this course and it wasn't overly interesting. I was only 13. I didn't really understand much, but I did find the Hindu chapter interesting. It was certainly very exotic and different from what I had been raised in. So that summer, my father took us to Nantucket Island for a 3-week vacation. I turned 14. We were in a small village with a sandy road, no store, no restaurant. I'm only 14, I can't go anywhere. And nobody my age, I was just bored out of my mind and the hormones were raging. I wanted to be anywhere but there. And I was constantly trying to think of ways to entertain myself. And one afternoon I was walking on the beach around 2 o'clock, and which I like to do now, but then I was just miserable. And trying to think of things to do, I remembered hearing in the class that Hindus chant Om. All I knew is it was a sound. I didn't know what was the name for frequencies that God uses to recreate the universe. It was only a sound. And I thought, well, what do I got to lose? I can sit down and chant and burn off at least 3 minutes of my boredom and then get up and find something else to be bored doing. So I started chanting, and that's not what happened. Almost immediately it changed from Om to Aum, which is the full sound of it, which nobody had told me. It just came out of me. And then shortly after that, I found myself chanting 3 notes simultaneously as a chord, Om chord, which they trained for decades to do in the Himalayas. And I'd never heard of that. I didn't know what or how or why I was doing it. It just came out. And the reason for both is that my soul knew that, and it told my vocal cavity what to do to make these sounds. Skipping my brain, it wasn't something cognitive, it just came. And so now there's this 3-note Om radiating from me. It radiates throughout the universe. Physical universe disappears. I'm just in the universe with this Om. And then there was just Om. And then, for lack of a better way to describe it, I went through a, let's say, a portal into an experience of God consciousness. We call it samadhi. And 6 hours later, I came out of it. And I've been a Hindu ever since. We hope during our lifetimes to be able to have experiences of the kind of consciousness we will ultimately be in for all eternity. And that's what that was. People ask, what'd you tell your parents? I didn't tell them anything. Didn't have any contact with a Hindu for decades. And I went along and became a lawyer for 23 years, and then started with Living Insights 20 years ago now, and started accumulating other experiences. Along the way, participating in a Native American ceremony, I had an experience of Shiva, a full-blown vision of Shiva, and I became a Shiva devotee 13 years ago, and that's when I started going to the Hindu temple and became so devoted that within a month I was their lead tour guide. Now, I have partial memories of 15 lifetimes. I am absolutely positive they are memories. They are not imaginary. The details are significantly detailed, and in many cases just confirmed by historical facts. And as I mentioned, it would seem totally ridiculous if I hadn't already told you that we reincarnate with people we've known in past lives. I know 4 women that I was married to in past lives who remember it as well. In some cases, we remember what we looked like, what our names were, what our house looked like, what our furniture was like, that sort of thing. And I know 2 other women who I was married to who don't remember. I could get into a lot of details, but these are experiences that I couldn't have imagined. These are memories. Again, with such detail and some kind of chronological fit together. Now, one of the fundamental concepts you will hear about in Hinduism is the concept of Dharma. People think of it in terms of duty, responsibilities, but that's kind of the microcosm of the macrocosm. Dharma is the set of dynamics which have to be accomplished, fulfilled for the universe to return to oneness with God. On a personal level, that means living a righteous life and fulfilling our spiritual objectives, our responsibilities, but it's much broader, obviously. We believe there are 4 stages in life, typically student, householder, where you have a family and career, then a stage where around age 50, which as it happens, coincidentally, I think not, but not intentionally, you leave the business world. I was corporate healthcare attorney for 23 years, and you stay engaged with society, but in a more spiritual way. That's Living Insights for me. And then around age 72, and I just turned 71, you're supposed to, if you follow this tradition, drop everything and go off into the woods and devote yourself entirely to spiritual matters. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of that in the United States. We don't have the cultural support network for it. Now, as I said earlier, there are many yogas, many ways to relate to God. This is a chart which it's just real busy, but to suffice to say, you can worship God, you can approach God through study, you can work with karma yoga, where you devote yourself to selfless service to people. You can meditate and other forms of yoga. We have our own version of the 10 Commandments. There are 24 of them. They overlap with the 10 Commandments, but include some other things like respecting your teacher, that sort of thing. I'm going to move kind of quickly because I do want to try to leave some time for questions. Now, worship, for those who worship, can, of course, take place in homes. I have an entire room devoted to a sanctuary in my home. Most Hindus will have at least a small sanctuary or altar. And in our worship, what we try to do is not just show devotion to God, but create a very direct, very conscious connection with God, which we call Darshan, which literally means seeing and being seen by God. And this can be worshiped through, directly with Brahman, but more typically it's worshiped through one of the deity forms because they have personalities and images, so they're more relatable. And people have an easier time relating to even Brahman, or relating to Brahman, which is what we're ultimately relating to if you can associate it with something visible. Now, when we do our worship service, which I will talk about, we believe the deity becomes present consciously within the icon, the statue, or other image, and also though within ourselves. So we're trying to create darshan where God isn't just present in the statue, but we experience it within ourselves as well. The missionaries said this was idol worship and thought Hindus were just worshiping a piece of metal or a piece of stone. Well, it's not any different from what you have in other faiths where you're worshiping through a sacred object. Now, here are some illustrations. As I said, there are a number of feminine forms of God. There is in the fall and a smaller version in the spring, a 9-night, 10-day festival of pujas, our word for service or ritual, excuse me. And all of them are devoted to female forms of God. So this is a temporary altar, which is, we use it so much now, we just keep it up. And every puja, though, it's decorated differently. And so this particular night, this was one of the divine feminine forms of God. We have one statue, and it is decorated differently each night to represent one of the female forms of God. This particular night was one of the forms that's related with Shiva. Now, our pujas are conducted through rituals, which can include ceremonies and chants and offerings. The chanting is in an ancient language, Sanskrit, which is not spoken in secular life, has the same origin as both Latin and Greek, although it doesn't sound like either one. And in our puja, the entirety of the puja is chanting. I go Monday nights, a Shiva night. The puja is 1 hour and 15 minutes, and it's 100% of the time chanting. Almost all of it is everyone chanting in unison if you're able. There's about 10 minutes that only the priests do. So it's a little bit like going to a mass in Latin if you were Catholic, but beyond that, because it's all chanting. The priests lead us in the chants. They, to some extent, have them memorized. Takes them many years to accomplish that. And some of the devotees have them memorized as well. Virtually all of the priests are male. They can, and I believe all of ours are married. And the priests do not deliver sermons or teachings. They're just functionaries. Very rarely will they even explain what's going on. And that's kind of a problem because it's in a language no one speaks, and most Hindus do not have translations into language they understand. So it's kind of a hard sell to get young people to go to the temple because they won't understand what they're saying and the priests don't explain it. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. When we enter the temple, we remove our shoes, which is symbolic of dropping the ego. We go around the temple in a clockwise manner, connecting with the various deities, focusing ourselves. Most of the pujas involve bathing the statues. You arrive and the statue does not have anything on it, but it's bathed with natural substances, and then it is decorated. And there's an offering of fruit and flowers and things. Those are blessed by the deity and then provided back to us. A flame is waved in front of the statue and then presented to us, and we will do like this to grab the flame. And this symbolizes dispelling ignorance and burning away our egos. And bells are rung, and that's symbolic of Om. So here are some images of what the interior of the temple looks like and some of the pujas, and you can't see it real well, but the interior, and we don't permit photographs to be taken, so I just have to take pictures from the website. But the interior is carved by same artisans who carved that, the Rajagopura. So here is the temple, the temporary altar, and behind it is to the right is the shrine for Vishnu. To the left is the shrine for Rama, and only the priests are allowed to walk into those. The temporary altar is set up because with some frequency, our pujas draw too many people to fit into the space that we have for the individual altars. So on this particular night, the temple was like this. There are hardly any chairs. People are typically seated on the floor. Thankfully, there are chairs for old people like me. They're standing room only. It becomes so full that we may have 1,200 people in the temple at a time, with people coming in, and we leave room for them to circumambulate and leave if there's no room for them. This is a picture of Vishnu decorated. Sometimes he is much more elaborately decorated than that. This is kind of medium range. It's decorated differently for each puja. And the same is true of Lakshmi. There's a Lakshmi puja every Friday night. Vishnu is Saturday morning. So each day has particular deities that they're devoted to. And so on the most elaborate of the decorating of Lakshmi that I've ever seen was this one. Typically, it's just a black granite statue. Now, we don't have any single scripture, as I said, but you've probably heard of the Vedas, maybe the Upanishads, and most likely the Bhagavad-Gita. The Vedas are our supposedly sacrosanct scriptures, but they predate the Reform period. The religion described in the original Vedas is not the one we have now. For example, there is no mention of Shiva in the Vedas. But then at the end of the Reform period, the Upanishads were compiled, and there are 108 of those, and they represent commentaries and evolutions of the Upanishads. So they are typically thought of as the ending of the Vedas, and Vedanta, when you hear that term, relates or refers to not the original Vedas, but to the end of the Vedas, the Upanishads. And the Bhagavad-Gita is, it's very short. It's the most accessible of our scriptures. Depending on the version you read, about 150 pages. They usually have some commentary. Some are really, really good. Some are really, really bad. I would advise you, if you want to read the Bhagavad Gita, do not read the one that comes from the Krishna consciousness people, because they have a very different view of what God is than all other Hindus. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna describes all of the yogas and describes the concept of Dharma. And it's again, the most accessible of our scriptures. We get a lot of questions about the caste system, and with justifiably, Hindus are embarrassed by the caste system, but they get a little more grief for the caste system than I think is justified. All cultures categorize people pretty much in the same way that Hindu culture has. You have the warrior political people, you have the business people, you have the workers, you have the priests, and you have the people who are just treated like nobody should be treated. what's different in India is that it's tied in with the system of karma. So it's kind of rigid, you know, you get what you deserve kind of thought. And India did not go through the Industrial Revolution, which kind of broke it down in Europe. You know, what you saw in feudal Europe was kind of very similar to what you had with the caste system. At any rate, discrimination based on caste is illegal in India now, just as discrimination on the basis of race is illegal in our country, and it works about as well. Both cultures have a long way to go to have people be treated equitably. The caste system is really breaking down. Racism, I guess, hopefully is really breaking down, but again, there's a long way to go. A couple of final thoughts. The religion is extremely durable, obviously. It has lasted so long because it's so flexible and so diverse, but it does confront challenges. And as I mentioned earlier, as is true of most of the religions these days, there's a real difficulty getting young people to be buying into the faith. In India, the whole culture, 85% of the people in India are Hindus, and the whole culture ingrains the religion in you. It's like a way of life. But over here, there's so many things to pull you in other directions. And when you're talking about going to a puja with a language that you don't understand and without even a translation, and your parents can say, I don't know what it means, but something has to do with cows. And there's a lot of esoteric, great wisdom in the puja, but if you don't know that, you're just going to be sitting there listening. And we believe that there are two languages on the planet that embody the energy of what the words refer to, yours and ours. And so we believe that you benefit from hearing Sanskrit, even if you don't know what the words mean. But it's hard to get young people to understand or agree with that. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. And I'm happy to stay as long as you wish to answer questions if you have any. And thank you for your attention.
Jack, that was a wealth of information. So does anybody, Bill, did you have a question, Bill Livingston?
I do. Does the religion have a Sabbath like the Judeo-Christians do, where it's a day of rest?
We don't have a day of rest, but we do have, I'll answer it this way. I'm a Shiva devotee, and Shiva's days are Sunday morning and all day Monday. So for me, I close the Living Insight Center on Monday as my Sabbath. If I were a Vishnu devotee, Vishnu is worshipped on Saturday. So Vishnu devotees would treat Saturday as their Sabbath. Lakshmi is worshipped on Friday. So someone who worships Lakshmi would consider Friday to be their Sabbath. So the Hindu temple's calendar is extremely complex because we're trying to accommodate people whose Ishta Devatas, the forms of God that they worship, are across the map over the entire week. So we don't have a single Sabbath, but depending on which deity you worship, that's your day.
Michael?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this was fascinating. While you were talking, I wrote some words down. Pantheism, Gnosticism, 20th century physics, the Christian concept of the Trinity, and the Catholic and Orthodox saints. And what they have in common is that there were some things, there were some aspects of Hinduism that brought these ideas to mind. And it suggests to me that there was some kind of exchange of these ideas. I somehow don't think that Hinduism and Western religion and scholarship kind of separately came up with these similar ideas. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of which ideas came into the West from the Hindus and vice versa.
Yeah, I do. First of all, I think the term which is closest of these terms like monotheism, pantheism, the term that most closely describes Hinduism is panentheism, where everything is God. Also, I would mention that a lot of Christians try to make the Hindu trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva fit with the Christian trinity, and that's totally, that doesn't fit at all. The only thing they have in common is that they're threes. There is very widely within Hindu culture, although I wouldn't say it's dominant, a belief, and there's some scholarship in the West to support this, that Jesus, during the years that he was unaccounted for, traveled the Silk Road and went to India and studied with Hindu and Buddhist mystics. There was a period of 500 years where Buddhism was actually the dominant religion in India, and it corresponds with the time of Jesus. So to take it to an extreme, there are people who believe that Jesus was an accomplished yogi, and yogis develop what are called siddhas, which are, siddhis, which are powers that they have, which are generally supposed to be just ignored. They're powers you have, but they are distractions from the ultimate goal of attaining oneness with God. One of the siddhis is the ability to drop your bodily functions down to a point that you can appear to be dead for, let's say, 3 days, and then resurrect your body. So there are people in India who believe that Jesus had that siddhi. He used that siddhi. He resurrected himself and then moved to Kashmir. And there is a temple in Kashmir, which Kashmiris believe holds the remains of Jesus. To be sure, there was a considerable amount of communication between India, both by water and by land, from the area which is sourced your faith and sourced Christianity. You know, you also had other influences with Zoroastrianism, with the first monotheistic religion in the West. And I'm not a scholar of how many connections there may have been. I suspect that maybe Rabbi Kaplansky might know more about that than I do, or maybe others. But I do believe there's a lot of overlap, especially when you consider that India was a really significant culture 5,000 years ago. You know, before Hinduism took its current form, there were thousands of years of culture. The Harappan culture in northwestern India had one of the largest cities in the world, like maybe, I think it might have been 5,000 years ago. So certainly people were mobile, and you could communicate across distances that we probably overestimate.
Harvey, you had your hand up next, and then we have a couple of chats. Harvey Gerstein.
I had a couple questions. One, how often per week are you supposed to pray? Secondly, what is the role of women? And thirdly, when I visited the Hindu temple, I was amazed at all the food and offerings. What happens to those?
Those are great questions. I hope I can remember all of them. We are supposed to live our lives in a prayerful state 24/7. As for me personally, and I'm sure Hindus are kind of all over the lot, after I visit the restroom in the morning, The first thing I do is prayers in my home shrine room. The last thing I do before I go to bed is another set of prayers. There are many ways of praying. Hindus very commonly will pray a mala. It's our version of a rosary. I keep it on me at all times. There are 108 beads, and we'll repeat a mantra, a form of prayer. So, you know, I think it's a daily practice for most Hindus, and you go beyond that to be in a state of being where you're living a prayerful state. So as an example, for most of my life as a Hindu, which again is 57 years, this notion that everybody is part of God was just a concept, you know, it was a thought. But I don't know how many years ago, it became a reality. And I don't walk around like feeling it, thinking it all the time, but it is absolutely no difficulty whatsoever for me to look at each of you and view you as part of God. Not think of you as part of God, but experience you as part of God. And so that's the kind of prayerful state, the prayerful awareness of God that we try to maintain continually. Food is presented to the deities during the pujas and is then distributed to people. So when this is done, typically after every puja, if you go down into the basement, there are tables, and the food which has been blessed is then served to people. And if there are leftovers, we do have ways to get food to the community. And Harvey, I forget what your second question was.
I believe the role of women.
The role of women.
Well, at the deity level, women are female forms of God are worshipped on mostly an equal standing. There are many Hindus who will worship a feminine form of God as their Ishtadevata. And, you know, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are considered incomplete without their female aspects. Priests are typically male. There are, I believe, 3,000 female priests in India. What I perceive typically happens is the priests, now remember, priests are functionaries. They're not really the top of the food chain. They don't teach. They're not considered illuminated beings. They just memorize the prayers and the rituals, the ceremonies. What I perceive happens is that women control how the religion is practiced in the home. The males are the priests in the temples. We do not separate women and men in our temple. There are some Hindu temples that do separate the men and the women, as I understand happens in parts of your faith. So I think there are still some vestiges of different roles for women. I don't know that being different means it's not equal, but women do have different roles from the men typically. Thank you.
So we have a question from Vicky. Do you have to select one particular deity, such as Lakshmi, Shiva,
yeah.
to worship?
No, in my home sanctuary, I have probably 5 or 6 represented. And, you know, each one represents a different aspect of God. My primary form I worship through is Shiva, but I do mantras with Ganesh every day. I acknowledge Lakshmi. I, you know, acknowledge several other forms every day. And within a family, you know, different family members may choose different forms to worship God through. But again, remember, we always understand behind the forms is the ultimate reality, which is formless. So they're just what, you know, fits for you. Dr. Naidu, as an example, is a Vishnu devotee, and he will not come to the Shiva Puja, except he will attend the main Shiva Pujas. There are, you know, some that are considered kind of like high holy days, and all Hindus, you know, will attend those. And I don't maintain a practice for Vishnu on a daily basis, but I will go to the main Vishnu Pujas during the year.
Stan Eckert has a question. Stan, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Actually, I'll stay muted in case I ask something foolish.
There's no foolish question, please.
I know. John, I enjoyed your speaking, your lecture, your information very much, very interesting, very informative. I find, and I do quite a bit of meditating on my own, and I look at things as whatever it means, a spiritualist or as a mystic. But beyond the things you're explaining now, to me, in any way, the more you meditate, the more you do the chants, then you go deeper and deeper into it. And until you hit that point, all these other words, it said, if you can speak about it, that's not it. And yet, how can we convey it other than words? To me, the God consciousness is the knowing, having experienced it as you have, as compared to just believing that I'm God consciousness here. That's just the words. And I find there's so many, I can only speak for Judaism, being Jewish, is that being 74 in those 60s years, if in Judaism, we'd have been exposed to more of what you're speaking of, the spirituality of it, I think more Jews in that point, myself included, would not have gone to Eastern philosophies. And I find that what you're saying, at least from my knowledge or belief, they're contained in everything at different levels. I think of Jewish mysticism as you're doing through Hinduism, and it's just overwhelming to me beyond how things are practiced on the surface. When you go deeper within to them, that they're completely different. They're much more centered to themselves, opposed to on the surface, they seem very different. But thank you oh so much for what you've said today.
Yeah, Stan, I agree with everything you said. The Living Insight Center is a very Hindu-founded sort of place because we try to present all of the religions on an equal footing. I do not use it as an attempt to convert people to my faith, but we have a Sufi mystic who's one of our teachers. We have a Kabbalah teacher who's on our board, actually. We have a Mormon. We have Dave Otten on our board. Carla Mae Streeter, who many of you know, used to be on our board until she kind of started retiring from such things. And my experience from working with the Sufi, working with the Kabbalah teacher, is that we do have one underlying reality, which once we get past the concepts, once we get past cognition, we're all relating to. My God, my ultimate God and your ultimate God can only be the same God. But it just happens that for you, a particular set of concepts, images, practices are what work in your soul. And for me, it's a different one. But I don't consider mine the only one or any better than yours. Hindus really are very happy with anybody who is in a faith that they devote themselves to and that produces the right kind of conduct rather than, you know, denigrating people in other faiths, but accepting people in other faiths. So Stan, namaste. And namaste to all of you.
We have a couple more questions in the chat, but Howard Kaplansky, did you have something that you had your hand up about? Will you need to unmute yourself, please?
Yes, I did. First, I want to thank Jack. Over the years, I've learned a lot from Jack and our participation in dialogue groups. It's just an observation. It's interesting that Hinduism derives its label from a geographical area, and there's an obvious similarity in Judaism. Yehud was an area, and people who lived in that Yehud became known as a people of Judah, and Judaism was their system of living. And I think there's a parallel between the two in how the people in those geographical areas, based on the impact of their environments, came to perceive reality and to develop perceptions of meaning, and then translating that into a system which eventually could be called a religion. So more an observation and a thank you to Jack.
Rabbi, I always learn just as much from you as you learn from me. So it's always a pleasure to share space with you.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
Cindy has a question in the chat, and she would like to know, how does one become a priest?
Typically, traditionally, and I think the tradition is probably still pretty much intact, you need to be born into the caste, the Brahmin caste. It sounds like Brahman, but that's A-N, and Brahmin ends I-N. And then it's it traditionally was a 12-year training period. And now I don't know that the 12 years is fully taken. But remember, traditionally, the first stage of life is the student stage of life. And in India, that was training for the people in the Brahmin caste, that was training to become a priest, basically. So it is traditionally something that you devote yourself to from a very young age. And when you attain adulthood, you would become a priest. The priests that we have at our temple here, I've looked over their bios, and I'd say they probably all, or at least most, have had at least 12 years of training, but I wouldn't swear to it.
Vicki has a couple of questions. Vicki, would you like to ask them yourself, or?
Whatever's easier.
Go ahead. Okay,
I have to go back and read them. Okay. Well, the first question, so I've got 3 here, and thank you so much. How do Hindus financially sustain their temples? Are there dues, or do you have weekly offerings like at the pujas?
They're both. The Hindu temple is a membership organization. I have donated enough over time to be what's called a life member. So I don't know, I'm not sure what the current annual membership fee is, but I think it's in the range of $300. When you become a member at that range, you become viewed as a sponsor of one of the weekly pujas. So as I indicated, the Shiva, there are actually 2 Shiva pujas during the week, Sunday morning and Monday evening. And I'm one of the annual sponsors for the Monday night puja. And people do donate. There are a number of safes where people are making donations when they visit the temple. And at the end of each puja, a plate with the fire arati, where you're burning away your ego, illuminating your ignorance, is circulated by one of the priests, and people will put money on the plate. So there's continuing offerings, but we have some members who've donated hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, the temple is only 20 years old, or roughly, I guess it's 23 years old. And as you may know, we just constructed 5 or 6 years ago a 30,000 square foot community center, cultural and education center right next door to the temple. And that actually, we're just about to send out the invitation, the announcements. That is actually going to be the venue for the Interfaith Partnership's annual dinner this year. Besides being vice president, I'm also in charge of the dinner committee. And the Hindu temple has volunteered that space for free for our event, which I'm very, very grateful for. And that was, I think, a $6 million project. And we built it and paid it off in 4.5 years, I think. So the Hindu community is very devoted to the temple and is, you know, the stereotype is largely true. There are a lot of affluent Hindus, doctors and engineers of you know, my generation that came over here from India and have the ability to put together what I think is fairly considered one of the top 20 Hindu temples in the United States.
Thank you. When you say prayers, are these standard words and formats similar to the Judeo-Christian religions, or is it just a matter of setting aside specific times of the day to speak whatever you want from your heart?
Well, it's both, but there are things I do every day. So Dr. Otten always likes me to do a little Sanskrit for people. So I begin my day and I begin each one of my prayer times with an invocation of Ganesh, with the prayers including, may all obstacles be removed that would prevent today's rituals from being effective for their intended purposes, and may all beings fulfill their dharmas with ease, grace, speed, and happiness, and be happy every day. And may those who are suffering get beyond their suffering with ease, grace, speed, and happiness through healing whenever necessary and appropriate. So I do that at the beginning of every day, and I do that in the evening every day as the beginning of a much longer set of prayers and mantras. And before I say those words, I invoke Ganesh, which I'll do for you with your permission. Om Gananam Tva Ganapati Gomavamahe Kavim Kavinam Upamashravastamam Jestrajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspata Anashranvanutipeseda Sadhanam Om Shri Mahanapati Namaha. So the mantras are, I wouldn't say formulaic, that sounds too mechanical. They are believed, what I just did is believed to invoke Ganesha's presence, not just saying his name or asking him, but actually making Ganesh become present for all of us, as you heard that. So part of it is in Sanskrit, and that I would not vary. And then part of it is my own prayers, and I do a lot of my own prayers with that as the introduction, the beginning of it.
So it's similar to Jews starting their day, some of them with particular Hebrew prayers, possibly, whereas there's certain prayers that we have in Hebrew and English, but then you can add your own extra. Is that similar?
I'm not familiar with what you do, but you can judge. I don't know what you do. I just told you a bit what I do, but it sounds like it would be similar, yes.
Maybe the rabbi can weigh in. Yes?
Yeah, it's similar. They're different. There's a formulaic construct for traditional prayer, and there are specific divisions in the liturgy. But it does vary from an Orthodox context, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and there's much more contemporary, many contemporary sources utilized in non-Orthodox Judaism that have found their way into the liturgy.
I think it's worth repeating that Hindus believe that Sanskrit and Hebrew are the only two languages where saying something embodies the energy of what it refers to. So while a mantra or the protracted chant that I gave you may be the same every time. It is not mechanical in any way. It is something that as I do it, I'm putting my heart into it, and I am experiencing that the invocation of Ganesh is very real. It is not just conceptual, but it's an actual experience that's happening. And my impression is the same is true in your faith. Rabbi?
Yeah, just thought with the use of the Hebrew in our liturgy, you know, a diminishing number of people really understand the actual meaning of the Hebrew. But I've always felt that there's a mystery to the Hebrew. And there are some things that I think can be said in Hebrew. And it's almost like the King James translation of the Bible. Their prayers, which I feel awkward doing in English without the these and the thous, because there was some majesty or mystery. And the same thing is true in Hebrew, like the Kaddish, the so-called mourner's prayer. Can give an explanatory introduction to the prayer, but there's a mystery in pronouncing the prayer, which is, by the way, not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, which was the vernacular of the people, the base cognate language of Hebrew.
Yeah, if you have the translation of the chants that we do Monday night, for example, some of it is really archaic. God, please don't shoot me with arrows. God, please make sure I have enough cows. And of course, we're not taking those words literally, but we are translating them into current terminology in our minds. So we're asking God to provide for us and to assure that we're safe and not to harm us, that sort of thing. And then there are other parts of it which are just cosmically mind-blowing in describing the nature of reality. And again, most of the Indians themselves don't know what those words mean. But I think they still do believe that by being present when they are chanted, that they're getting the benefit of it. And picking up on what Rabbi Kaplansky said, there's a mystery involved in all of that.
Jack, I want to thank you so very much. This was very, very helpful and very informative. We really very much appreciate all of the information that you've helped us learn today. We did have another question about your PowerPoint, if that could be shared, and any suggested readings. With that being said, I want to first say to everyone, this was recorded today. If you would like to hear it again, or even look at the PowerPoint as Jack was interpreting the words on the screen, it will be available on our website, and it's under the Mirowitz Center, our resources. And so you can check there for the recording. But Jack, how do you feel about sharing your PowerPoint, or just would it be on the Zoom?
I'd kind of prefer to leave it at that because first of all, I have found that when I send my PowerPoint, it gets garbled. The formatting gets lost. And I did have an unfortunate experience of someone taking my PowerPoint and changing it for their own purposes and not giving me credit. And, you know, I don't want to have to bother with that.
Thank you so much. Well, do you have any suggested readings?
There are many, many books on Hinduism. I would say that, first of all, Houston Smith's book used to be called The Religions of Man, but it's The World's Religions, and it comes in an illustrated form. That is a really good introduction to Hinduism. And if you want to get a little deeper, the Bhagavad-Gita is a really good starting place. And by the way, the movie Bagger Vance, if you've seen it, is the Bhagavad-Gita updated. That's just kind of an aside. There are my favorite of the many, many translations and commentaries is one by Christopher Isherwood. with one of the Vedanta Society priests. I think it dates back decades, but it's beautifully written, and the commentary is really pretty good. There are some translations that you won't understand, won't really get what they're talking about. And there are some commentaries that are really distorted, I think. So if you can find Christopher, I'm sure you can, Christopher Isherwood's version of the Bhagavad-Gita, bear in mind, you're reading something that is maybe 3,000 years old, 25, well, probably more like 2,200 years old, maybe. I'm not really sure how old it is, but it's very old, and it describes a different culture, but the concepts will get to you if you read it and spend the time to grasp it.
Jack, again, thank you so much. Thank you on behalf of the Mirowitz Center and the FEL group, the Friends Enjoying Life Men's Group. We really appreciate you today and your lecture. And so thank you everyone for joining us. And I think at this time we are going to have to end. Thank you and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you for staying over. I appreciate your time.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.